A Muslim diplomat, far from the warm sands of his homeland, found himself on the cold, muddy banks of the Volga River in the year 922 AD. His name was Ahmad Ibn Fadlan, emissary of the Abbasid Caliphate, scholar, and meticulous recorder of foreign customs. He had travelled thousands of miles from Baghdad, through endless steppes and frozen forests, to bring Islam to the Bulgar people of the north. But what he saw here was not the spread of faith. It was something else entirely. On that day, as grey clouds hung low over the river and the smell of smoke clung to the air, Ibn Fadlan witnessed a ritual that would haunt him until his last breath. Before him stood the fearsome Rus Viking raiders who had sailed their longships deep into the heart of Eastern Europe, men with hair the colour of wheat and eyes cold as winter ice. They had come not only for trade and conquest, but to perform one final, grotesque ceremony for their fallen leader. A chieftain lay dead, his body stretched out like a sleeping giant. But death, for the Vikings, was not an end. It was a passage. And that passage, they believed, could be paved with flesh, fire, and pleasure. Ibn Fadlan watched as a young slave girl was chosen to accompany her master into the afterlife. She was not chosen for her loyalty, her wisdom, or her kinship, but for her body, which in the eyes of the Vikings was about to become a sacred vessel. She did not resist. Perhaps she believed the promises whispered to her that she would walk with her master in the great halls of Valhalla, drink mead from golden cups, and live forever among warriors and gods. Or perhaps she knew resistance was futile, that her life was now part of a ritual older than memory. For the next days, Ibn Fadlan recorded with clinical horror the girl was passed among the men of the tribe, not as an act of random depravity, but as a deliberate rite, each man claiming to send part of his life force through her, a spiritual essence they believed would strengthen the dead chieftain in the afterlife. They told her, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." The night before the funeral, the air grew heavy with drink, song, and the crackle of torches. The girl was plied with strong ale until her voice slurred and her steps faltered. She was adorned in fine clothes and jewellery, her skin painted, her hair woven with bright ribbons as though she were a bride preparing for her wedding. But this was no marriage. This was a journey to a pyre. When the funeral day arrived, the tribe gathered by the longship. 6 men took her, one after another, inside a tent set upon the ship's deck. Ibn Fadlan's words, etched in ink centuries ago, tell us that she submitted to each in turn, the act witnessed by those outside. Then, in a sudden shift from intimacy to brutality, an old woman known as the Angel of Death appeared. She was the priestess, executioner, and guide to the other world. The woman looped a cord around the girl's neck, pulling it tight, while others drove a blade into her ribs. As the life drained from her body, her corpse was placed beside the chieftain, as though they were lovers in an eternal embrace. The ship was set aflame. Orange tongues of fire climbed the mast, curling around the sails as black smoke poured into the sky. The people chanted, their voices rising in unison with the crackling wood and the smell of burning flesh. They believed the fire would carry both the chief and his bride to the next world. To Ibn Fadlan, this was no sacred rite. It was a spectacle of cruelty, masked as devotion. And yet, as he wrote, there was no shame in the faces of the Vikings, only pride. To them, this was an honour beyond measure, a final proof of dominance and a testament to the chief's power, even in death. Modern archaeology has since confirmed pieces of his account. The Oseberg burial ship in Norway, unearthed in 1904, contained the remains of 2 women, one elderly, one young, the latter showing signs of violent death. Other Scandinavian graves tell similar tales, their bones whispering the same brutal story across 1,000 years. But this was only the first scene in the Vikings' theatre of sex, power, and violence. What Ibn Fadlan saw in that funeral was not an isolated atrocity, it was the distilled essence of a culture where intimacy could be weaponized, where pleasure and pain were bound so tightly together that to pull them apart was unthinkable. A culture where, as we shall see, the line between honor and horror was as thin as a blade's edge. In Viking society, a man's place in the world was determined not only by the battles he fought or the treasures he plundered, but by something far more intimate: his role in sex. Power in the bedroom was power in the community, and the rules were written with the blunt clarity of a battle axe. Two words haunted Viking men: ergi and ragr. They were not casual insults, they were verbal death sentences. Ergi implied that a man was unmanly, cowardly, or, most damning of all, sexually passive. Ragr carried an even sharper edge, branding someone as the receptive partner in a sexual act. In a culture obsessed with dominance, to be penetrated, whether by force or by choice, was to lose your honor entirely. This wasn't just playground name-calling. The Viking law codes explicitly stated that accusing a man of being sexually passive could justify his murder. If you called someone ragr and he killed you for it, the law would stand on his side. It was as though your words had committed a crime greater than your death. The result was a society constantly on the brink of violence. In the Icelandic sagas, we see feuds ignite over a single whispered slight. The saga of Burnt Njal describes a bloody chain of events set off because one man mocked another's masculinity. Dozens died in the ensuing conflict. In Egil's saga, warriors rode for days across frozen mountains to kill a man who had dared suggest they were less than virile. For the Vikings, dominance was not a private matter. It was public currency. The man who took the active role in sex reinforced his masculinity. The one who took the passive role was stripped of it. And this wasn't symbolic. There were tangible, brutal consequences. Men branded as ragr could lose the right to testify in court, inherit property, or even carry weapons. Citizenship itself could be revoked by the rumor of sexual submission. Women knew this too, and some wielded it as a weapon sharper than steel. The sagas tell of wives who publicly humiliated their husbands, destroying their reputations in front of the community. In the Laxdala saga, one woman divorced her husband and ruined his standing by claiming he was too gentle in bed, a seemingly personal insult that, in this culture, marked him as socially unfit. It was psychological warfare wrapped in marital politics. This obsession with masculine dominance created a vicious cycle. Men were under constant pressure to prove themselves, which led to violent displays of strength. Violence, in turn, reinforced the idea that only the dominant survived, and so the wheel spun on, each generation more brutal than the last. But the Vikings didn't stop at private accusations. They weaponized humiliation on the battlefield, turning their enemy's defeat into a spectacle of emasculation. The clamhog, or shame stroke, was one such method: a slash or stab to an enemy's buttocks, symbolizing anal penetration. It was a way of marking a man as conquered without even having to commit the act. The message was clear: you are no longer a man, you are ours. This fusion of sexual dominance and public honor was unique in its precision. Other warrior cultures valued strength, courage, and conquest. But the Vikings tied those values directly to sexual roles. For them, masculinity wasn't just about who you could defeat in battle, it was about who you could dominate in every possible sense of the word. If the funeral Ibn Fadlan witnessed revealed the Vikings' belief that sexual energy could follow a man into death, their everyday laws and customs revealed something even darker: that sex itself was a battlefield, and losing on that field was worse than dying. The Vikings understood something that many armies throughout history never fully grasped. Killing an enemy could end his life, but breaking his spirit could destroy everything he stood for. And so, they developed a grim art, turning sexual humiliation into a weapon of psychological annihilation. One of their most infamous tactics was the clamhog, or shame stroke. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than a crude wound, usually a slash or stab to the buttocks. But in the Viking mind, it was far more symbolic. That strike wasn't about inflicting pain. It was about sending a message that every warrior understood instantly. It meant, you have been penetrated. You are no longer a man. This act could be carried out in the heat of battle or in the cold aftermath, when the victors walked among the defeated, choosing who would die and who would live in shame. For leaders and elite warriors, the punishment could go further. Captured kings were sometimes publicly raped, not out of lust, but as a calculated performance for the watching crowd. The sagas tell us that forcing a man into the passive role didn't just humiliate him, it was believed to transfer his masculine essence to the victor. To violate a king was to strip him of his power and claim it for yourself. The psychological damage was immense. In a culture where manhood defined your very right to exist, returning home as a sexually conquered man was unthinkable. Some victims took their own lives rather than face their families. Others were cast out, reduced to wandering between villages as living reminders of Viking dominance. These outcasts carried no weapons, owned no land, and bore the silent mark of dishonor for the rest of their days. What made this system so effective was its efficiency. The Vikings didn't always have to carry out the act itself. Sometimes the threat was enough. The knowledge that being captured could lead to such humiliation caused enemies to surrender before a single blade was drawn. In a world where death in battle could be honorable, sexual defeat was worse than the grave. There are echoes of this strategy in other warrior cultures. Ancient Greek armies sometimes used sexual conquest as a way of marking a city as defeated. In the Roman world, the sexual violation of enemy leaders was an unspoken act of domination, though rarely recorded openly. But the Vikings made it systematic, almost ritualistic, weaving it into their sagas and laws as part of their cultural identity. Even the gods weren't immune from the sting of sexual insult. Loki, the trickster god, was mocked in Norse myths for taking on female forms and even bearing children. Odin himself, the All-Father, was accused by rivals of engaging in practices that were considered ergi. These jabs were more than theological gossip, they reflected a real societal fear that masculinity could be lost, stolen, or corrupted. For the Vikings, the battlefield didn't end when the fighting stopped. It continued in the minds of their enemies, in the whispered stories of humiliation that spread through villages, and in the sagas that preserved those moments for generations. Death removed a warrior from the fight. Humiliation turned him into a warning, and this was only one piece of the Vikings' larger strategy. Sexuality, in all its brutal forms, wasn't just an aspect of their private lives, it was baked into their economy, their legal system, and even their methods of conquest. Nowhere was this more evident than in the thriving slave markets that fueled their expansion. If Viking raids were the spearhead of their expansion, slavery was the iron shaft that gave it weight. The Norse didn't just plunder gold, silver, and livestock, they took people, and in staggering numbers. Dublin, York, Hedeby. These were not just bustling Viking trading hubs. They were engines of human trafficking, moving flesh as casually as they moved furs or amber. At the heart of this system was a cold hierarchy enshrined in law. Free women, whether born into privilege or rising through marriage, had strong protections against sexual assault. Violating them could carry punishments as severe as death or outlawry. But enslaved women thralls had no such shield. In the eyes of Viking law, they were property. Any free man could use a slave sexually without her consent, and killing her for resisting was treated as little more than property damage. The penalty for raping a slave woman was often the same as for killing a prized hunting dog, a fine paid in silver. The scale of this sexual enslavement was immense. Archaeological studies of Viking Dublin suggest that as much as 30% of its population at certain points were slaves, many of them women and children taken from Ireland, Scotland, and the Slavic lands. These captives were sorted much like livestock, the strongest for hard labour, the most skilled for household work, and the most physically attractive for the intimate service of their owners. The sagas record this matter-of-factly. The Orkneyinga saga mentions Earl Sigurd keeping a harem of Irish women, a collection he treated as interchangeable objects for his pleasure. Other accounts speak of captives being paraded through markets, stripped to demonstrate their youth and beauty before being sold. In some cases, the captives' original names were replaced with nicknames or numbers, stripping them of identity as completely as they were stripped of freedom. This wasn't mere cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was strategy. The Vikings understood that the mere threat of such treatment could break a community before a single sword was drawn. Coastal villages, hearing what happened to women taken by the Norse, sometimes surrendered without resistance, hoping to avoid the horrors of capture. In this way, sexual slavery became not just an economic tool, but a psychological weapon of conquest. The markets themselves were organized with ruthless efficiency. In Dublin, the Viking quarter teemed with traders who could acquire a captive in Ireland one week and sell her in Scandinavia the next. York's Coppergate district, excavated in the 20th century, revealed artifacts from as far away as Byzantium evidence that the Viking slave trade was tied into a global network stretching from the North Sea to the Silk Road. Even the church got tangled in this grim economy. Records from medieval clerics lament the sale of Christian captives to Muslim buyers in the East, often routed through Viking intermediaries. The irony was bitter. The same warriors who mocked the Christian God in their own lands were profiting from selling his followers abroad. For the captives, the journey rarely ended in freedom. Some were assimilated into their masters' households, their children born into slavery unless formally freed. Others were traded again and again, passed from hand to hand like coins. A rare few bought their liberty, or were freed as a token of goodwill. But these were exceptions in a world where human bodies were as commodified as any trade good. The Vikings' sexual economy was not an ugly byproduct of their conquests. It was an engine that drove them. Every raid that ended with captives in chains fed the markets, and every silver coin earned in those markets fueled the next voyage. In the Norse world, power was measured not just in swords and ships, but in the human lives you controlled. And yet, for all their brutality, the Vikings reserved their most intrusive rituals not for slaves, but for themselves at weddings that were less about romance and more about property, politics, and public proof of virility. In the Viking world, marriage was not a private affair. It was a contract, a transaction, and most unsettling to modern sensibilities, a performance. Where we might imagine quiet vows before family and friends, the Norse turned their weddings into public trials of sexual legitimacy. The bride and groom's intimacy was not their own. It was a matter for witnesses, law, and the collective judgment of the community. At the heart of the ceremony was Mjolnir. Thor's hammer, not a weapon in this context, but a symbol of fertility. During the vows, the hammer was placed on the bride's lap, an unmistakable gesture with explicit sexual overtones. This was no subtle metaphor. Everyone in the hall understood the implication. The hammer was then blessed and passed among the guests, transforming the sacred object into a communal fertility charm. The moment the bride's ceremonial crown was removed by the groom, it signaled to all present that she was about to be deflowered. There was no pretense of privacy. In many weddings, family members would physically escort the couple to the marriage bed. Priests and elders blessed the bed itself, often with language that today would sound more like bawdy tavern humor than solemn ritual. And then came the consummation, a legal requirement as much as a personal one. In some households, trusted witnesses would wait outside the bedchamber, straining their ears for the sounds that proved the act had taken place. In more extreme cases, a close relative, sometimes an uncle, sometimes a matron, remained in the room to serve as an eyewitness. This was not voyeurism for its own sake. It was legal insurance. If, in the years to come, the marriage was disputed, those witnesses could testify that the union had been properly completed. The morning after, the blood-stained bedsheets were displayed as evidence of the bride's virginity. These sheets were not just a grim token of the wedding night, they were often preserved as legal documents. If a husband later claimed his wife had not been a virgin at marriage, the sheets could be brought before a court as proof to the contrary. The stakes were high. If the bride was found not to be a virgin, her family could be sued for fraud and forced to return the dowry. If the groom failed to perform, his family might owe compensation for damaged goods. The Icelandic law codes spelled out exact penalties for different failures, treating sexual performance as part of the economic contract between families. The sagas, with their mix of legal precision and human drama, record more than one humiliation on the wedding night. In Grettis' saga, a bride's uncle sits in the room to ensure the act is done properly, a moment that feels almost like dark comedy to modern readers, but for the Vikings it was deadly serious. The honor of two families, and sometimes their political alliances, rested on what happened in that bed. Anthropologists have found parallels to this practice in other parts of the ancient world. In certain regions of medieval Europe and the Middle East, public or semi-public consummations served the same purpose: to bind the union in the eyes of the community and to eliminate disputes over inheritance and legitimacy. But the Vikings' approach, with its ritualized symbols and legalistic safeguards, was unusually blunt. Love, in all this, was a luxury. Marriage was about alliances, property, and lineage. The bride's feelings mattered little. The groom's desires were secondary to his ability to perform. The real audience for the wedding night was not the couple themselves, but the entire network of kin, neighbors, and political allies whose fortunes could rise or fall on the outcome. It was a world in which intimacy was never entirely private, where even the most personal act could become a matter of public record. And if this was the case for the living, imagine what the Vikings demanded of the dead. If Viking weddings were legal contracts sealed in the bedchamber, Viking funerals could be something far more sinister: rituals where sex, death, and belief collided in acts so extreme that even hardened warriors spoke of them in hushed tones. We return now to the account of Ahmad Ibn Fadlan, who stood among the Rus Vikings on the Volga in 922 AD and watched what has become one of the most notorious descriptions of a funeral in history. When a chieftain died, his people believed that he would not journey to the next world alone. He required a companion, someone to serve him, comfort him, and share his pleasures in Valhalla. That companion would be a living woman. The process began with a chilling question to the dead man's slave girls: "Who among you will die with him?" From among them, one would volunteer, whether out of faith, fear, or coercion, we cannot know. She would be dressed and treated like a bride, but her wedding feast would end in flames. In the days that followed, she became the center of a ritual that merged sexuality with spiritual transfer. Ibn Fadlan describes how the chosen girl was taken to the tents of various men, each of whom claimed to give her a message for the dead chieftain through the act of sex. The men would tell her, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." They believed their life force Other, in Old Norse, was passing through her to empower the chieftain's spirit in the afterlife. The girl was plied with alcohol and drugs, perhaps to numb her, or to elevate her into a trance-like state. Day by day, the intensity of the ritual increased. More men, more encounters, more chanting and toasts in the dead man's honor. What might look like drunken debauchery to an outsider was, to the Vikings, a sacred duty. They were arming their leader with vitality for his journey beyond the grave. On the final day, she was led to the chieftain's ship, which had been prepared as his funeral pyre. Inside a tent on the deck, 6 men each representing a different strength of the tribe had sex with her one after another. Then came the Angel of Death, an older woman who acted as priestess and executioner. She placed a rope around the girl's neck, pulling tight, while others held her down. A dagger thrust into her ribs ensured she would never struggle again. Her body was laid beside the chieftain's as though they were sleeping lovers. The ship was set alight, the flames racing up the mast, black smoke curling into the sky. The people chanted, calling on the gods to receive their chief and his bride in glory. To them, the girl had been transformed into a goddess-like figure, carrying the tribe's collective power to the realm of the dead. For centuries, scholars doubted Ibn Fadlan's account, dismissing it as Islamic moralizing or exaggerated barbarity. But archaeology has spoken. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway contained 2 women, one older, one young, one of whom showed signs of violent death. Other Scandinavian graves reveal similar pairings. High-status men buried with young women, whose injuries suggest ritual killing. Even if not every Viking funeral followed this exact pattern, The fact that it happened at all reveals a worldview in which sex and death were inseparably bound. It also underscores the brutal hierarchy of Viking society. Free women would never be chosen for such a role. It was always a slave, someone with no rights, whose body and life belonged entirely to her masters. From a modern perspective, the ritual reads like one of the most systematic examples of sexual violence disguised as religious devotion in human history. But for the Vikings, it was an act of loyalty, power, and cosmic necessity. The dead chieftain would ride into Valhalla not alone, but with the life energy of his people channeled through the body of the girl who burned beside him. And yet, this same society that demanded such horrors from its slaves also granted its free women rights and powers that would not be seen in the rest of Europe for centuries. In the Norse world, womanhood existed in a razor-sharp paradox. If you were born free, the law could be your shield, granting rights that would make many medieval European women envious. But if you were born a slave or worse, captured in a raid, your body and fate were little more than property, as disposable as a broken sword. Free Viking women could own land, inherit property, and even initiate divorce, an astonishing freedom for the 9th and 10th centuries. A wife dissatisfied with her husband's sexual performance could end the marriage with little more than a public statement and walk away with her dowry and property intact. The sagas are full of such examples. Women leaving men who were too timid in bed, who failed to defend their honor, or even who wore clothing deemed too feminine. In Njal's saga, Holgertha leaves her husband because his shirt exposes too much of his chest, declaring it unmanly. Oh, some women became powerful landowners and merchants. Un the Deep-Minded, a legendary matriarch in the Laxdala saga, commanded her own ships, arranged marriages for her male relatives, and held vast estates in Iceland and beyond. Archaeology has confirmed that some women were buried with weapons, suggesting they may have been warriors in their own right. Others were interred with merchant scales and weights, symbols of economic power. Free women were also legally protected from unwanted advances. Viking law codes specified that unwelcome kissing, touching, or sexual intercourse without consent could be punishable by exile or even death penalties more severe than in most of contemporary Europe. Consent, at least for free women, mattered, but that protection stopped cold at the boundary of freedom. Enslaved women had no voice, no recourse. The same legal code that guarded a free woman's autonomy explicitly stated that a slave was the sexual property of her owner. The contrast was stark, deliberate, and cruel. By elevating the status of free women, Viking society underscored the total degradation of the enslaved. Even free women could perpetuate this system. In the sagas, some wives urged their husbands and sons to commit acts of sexual violence against enemies, knowing it would cement their family's dominance. Others managed slave households where women were expected to provide sexual services to guests. Maintaining one's own freedom often meant upholding the very hierarchy that condemned others. And then there was the shadow side of Viking family life: female infanticide. Baby girls, especially in poor families, were sometimes exposed, left outside to die from cold or predators if resources were scarce or if the family saw no future advantage in raising them. The sagas mention this practice almost casually, as if it were a grim but accepted fact of life. It created a society where a small number of surviving free women could hold considerable power, while the majority of women captured, enslaved, or abandoned lived under brutal subjugation. To outsiders, the Norse woman could appear as both shield maiden and slave mistress, business owner and beneficiary of systemic cruelty. This duality was not a contradiction in their eyes, it was the order of things. A free woman's rights were a mark of her elevated status. A slave woman's suffering was a reminder of what freedom was worth. But Viking ideas about power and sexuality did not stop at the division between men and women. Their beliefs reached into the realms of myth, magic, and the gods themselves, where even deities could be accused of sexual shame. In the Norse world, even the gods weren't safe from the sting of sexual politics. Their myths are full of jabs and accusations that mirrored mortal society's obsession with dominance and shame. Loki, the trickster, was perhaps the most scandalous figure. He could change shape at will sometimes into a mare, even giving birth to Odin's legendary eight-legged horse, Sleipnir. This was a source of endless mockery among the gods. Taking on a female form, especially to bear children, was the ultimate ergi, a sign of sexual passivity. Yet Loki's cunning and power meant that, while he was ridiculed, he was never dismissed outright. Even Odin, the All-Father himself, came under fire. He practiced seether, a form of magic associated with women, which required adopting feminine ritual roles. His rivals accused him of unmanliness for this, yet Odin's mastery of seether also gave him unmatched foresight and control. In Viking eyes, this created a paradox. The most powerful man in the cosmos also bore the stain of ergi. Power and shame could coexist, tangled like the roots of Yggdrasil itself. This complexity echoed in mortal law. The Vikings did not forbid same-sex relations outright. What mattered was who took the active role. As long as a man was the penetrator, his reputation remained intact whether his partner was male or female. But to be accused of taking the passive role was so serious that false accusations could be punished as severely as murder. Sexuality was not just private behavior, it was public theater. Criminal punishments often had a sexual component designed to humiliate. Rapists might be subjected to public sexual assault before execution. Adulterers could be castrated in front of cheering crowds. These were not only acts of vengeance, but reaffirmations of the social order. Some sagas describe entire festivals where captured enemies were forced into degrading sexual acts for the amusement of the audience. The Jomsvikinga saga tells of contests to see how long prisoners could endure elaborate humiliations before dying or going mad. Archaeological sites support these accounts. Execution grounds reveal bodies mutilated in ways that suggest sexualized violence was part of the spectacle. For the Vikings, sex, honor, and violence were threads of the same rope. Their society turned intimate acts into tools of law, war, and entertainment. It was a system as brutal as it was precise, shaping the medieval world and leaving echoes we can still hear today in concepts of masculinity, shame, and dominance. The legacy of the Norse is not just in their ships or their sagas, but in the ways they taught the world to wield sexuality as a weapon, a legacy both fascinating and deeply unsettling, and that, perhaps, is why their stories still grip us. They are a mirror, however warped, showing how power always finds its way into the most private corners of human life. If you've made it this far, you've walked through some of the darkest corridors of Viking history. But there are countless other cultures with equally shocking secrets buried in their past. Which one should we explore next? Ancient Rome's twisted emperors, the Aztec rites of blood and passion, or perhaps the scandalous courts of medieval France? Tell me in the comments what civilization's hidden history you want me to uncover. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more untold stories, and share it with someone who thinks they know what Viking really means. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep your curiosity sharp and your history darker than ever.